All right, welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask if everyone can be seated. Please make sure that cell phones and other electronic devices are turned off and muted before we start. Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society. My name is Bobby Jacob, and I'll be moderating today's program, How to Stop Gun Violence Before It Starts, by Jens Ludwig. So we'll go ahead and kick off the lecture with a small reading about what it means to be an ethical humanist, something that's related, and Glenda will go ahead and do that for us.
Good morning, everybody. I just have a short quote for everyone. Nonviolence is a very powerful weapon. Most people don't understand the power of nonviolence and tend to be amazed by the whole idea. Those who have been involved in bringing about change and see the difference between violence and nonviolence are firmly committed to a lifetime of nonviolence, not because it is easy or because it is cowardly, but because it is an effective and very powerful way. Cesar Chavez.
Thank you. Should I go ahead and dismiss the Sunday school? Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and dismiss the Sunday school. All right. At the EHS, our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to public policy. Jens Ludwig is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, the director of the university's crime lab, and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. He helped found the crime lab and its sister organization, the Education Lab, to work closely with government agencies as an R&D partner to use data science to help improve social conditions out in the real world. Crime lab projects have been published in leading academic journals, discussed in leading national news outlets like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and most importantly, led to policy changes in Chicago, New York, and other US cities. For the past 25 years, Professor Ludwig has examined why gun violence happens and what we can do about it. In today's lecture, he will discuss his new book, Unforgiving Places, The Unexpected Origins of American Gun Violence. Please welcome Professor Ludwig.
Great. Thanks very much. Is it projecting? Oh, perfect. Great. Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. Maybe let me thank you also for coming out on such a beautiful fall morning here in Chicago. I've lived here long enough to realize this is par for the course for this time of year. Maybe what I'll do for starters is just spend a minute sharing why I wrote this book. So I was the first 12 years of my working life, I was at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And then the fall of 2007, I moved to the University of Chicago. And that fall, there's a doctoral student named Amadou Sis from Senegal finishing up his doctoral dissertation in chemistry. So if you don't know anything about chemistry departments, I didn't know anything before this myself. The University of Chicago's chemistry department, their PhD program is one of the best in the entire world. And one of the other things that I didn't know before I went off to get my own PhD was PhD studies are very different from every other part of the university. You don't pay to go, they pay you to go. So this is to say that maybe 6 or 7 years before I arrived at the University of Chicago, Amadou Sis and his family are in Senegal, and they get a letter from the graduate school at the University of Chicago that says, congratulations, your kid has just won a full ride to one of the very best chemistry PhD programs in the world. So this is like the Willy Wonka golden ticket. You know, your kid will go off to Hyde Park, and then for the rest of their lives, they'll be set. Whatever he wants to do after that, like he will write his own story in life. Especially coming from Senegal, think about how amazing that is. So that fall, he defends his doctoral dissertation successfully. He's on track to go off out into the world and do whatever he wants. A couple of weeks after defending, at 1:30 in the morning, he's coming home to his apartment from an ice cream social, and he's on the porch, and when somebody, this was about a block from my office at the University of Chicago, when someone tries to rob him at gunpoint of his backpack and his water bottle. I don't know if his backpack got stuck on his shoulder accidentally or if he reflexively tried to hold on to it, but either way, the person robbing him wound up shooting him in the chest point blank with a stolen .22. He gets raced down Lakeshore Drive to Northwestern ER where he's pronounced dead. This is just a reminder. For starters, this is a reminder that behind every statistic and every news headline, there's a mom who has lost the most important person in their entire world. And the other thing that I would share about this story is the guy who shot him was a 17-year-old named Demetrius Warren. I think that's his name. And he's now spending, I think his sentence was 120 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections. So that's to remind us with events like this, two moms wound up losing the most important people in their lives. So this led to a lot of soul searching at the University of Chicago. We like to say that we've won more Nobel Prizes than any other university in the world. And yet here we can see we're not having nearly as much impact as we should, literally in our own backyard. As I said, this was like a block from my office on campus. So the University of Chicago, the National Academy of Sciences had just come out with a 300-page Blue Ribbon Commission report reviewing the best available data in science about how to prevent gun violence in America. And the conclusion was, we don't know anything. We don't know anything from the data and all of the scientific evidence that would actually be useful to a policymaker. And so the deans at the University of Chicago were going around saying, what can we do to be helpful on this problem? And I said, this seems to me like the most important problem. And it happens to be one that a great urban research university, I would say the best urban research university in the world for my money, should be working on. And so we started the University of Chicago Crime Lab to try and be R&D partners, as Bobby said, with the public sector to try and solve that problem. What should we actually do that would be useful? And the book, in some sense, summarizes what I think we've learned over the last 18 years. And I would also say most of what we've learned, the frontline practitioners have been seeing this problem very clearly in a way that is very different from the larger public conversation. And so in some sense, the point of the book is to try and collect the lessons that the frontline practitioners have learned and put a spotlight on that, and also provide a conceptual framework that helps a lot of things that might initially seem very disconnected, helps you see what the conceptual framework is, what the understanding of the problem is that ties them together. So that's sort of, I'll give you a brief overview and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and comments and suggestions. So maybe the place to start is just to remind us that this is a problem that is, you can tell that I made this slide up myself because it's incompetently done. This is the US bar here on the far left here. And what this graph reminds us all of is that this problem of lethal interpersonal violence is unique to America among the rich countries of the world, right? So this is the murder rate per 100,000 people. And you can see that the United States is completely off the charts, even compared to developed countries that you don't think of as being particularly well run, like Turkey. People in Turkey are looking at the United States thinking, what in the world is going on in America? The other thing that is worth highlighting here is that when I break up every country's murder rate per 100,000 people into murders with guns and murders without guns, you can see the blue part of each bar is the murders without guns, and that's not all that dramatically different across countries. The US exceptionalism really is driven by our excess rate of murders with guns. And from the public's perspective, it turns out that is the crime problem, right? The public doesn't like its cars stolen, we don't like burglaries, we don't like our bikes being stolen from the bike rack in front of work. But the thing that is really, really petrifying to the American public is gun violence, understandably so. This is a problem, so terrible problem compared to other countries around the world, and also a problem that we have not made much progress on. Right? So you can see that the murder rate in the US today is almost exactly the same as it was in 1950. And if I rewound this graph all the way back to 1900, the murder rate is almost exactly what it was in 1900 as well. This stands in stark contrast to most other leading causes of death in the United States, where mortality rates have plummeted. There are mainly two exceptions: cancer and homicide. Okay, and so the argument that I want to make is that the reason that we haven't made more progress on this problem is that we've been framing the problem incorrectly. I should note, this is about as funny as economics. I'm an economist by training. This is about as funny as economics humor gets. So if you don't like this, it's not going to get any better as we go forward. So I think we've been framing the problem incorrectly. And the good news is that if we can think of the problem, if we can look at it in a different light, I think that opens the door to lots of new ways of making progress on the problem. And I want to argue that it's actually much more solvable than one would think, looking at the scale and the persistence of the problem in the United States. You would look at that and think it's unsolvable, and I think that turns out not to be right. Okay, so for starters, how have we been thinking about the problem? I think if you go back to this graph and you say, here's a pattern that you can easily notice in this graph, which is the United States, as everybody here knows, the United States has very different gun laws than the United Kingdom does. Our gun laws are much more permissive than they have in the United Kingdom. As a result, we have lots more guns per capita. So we have something like 400 million guns in a country of, call it 330 million people. The United Kingdom has far fewer guns per capita than us. And so you would look at this graph for starters and say, this is going to be a very short talk. I know exactly what's going on here. The problem is differences in gun control across countries, differences in the number of guns. QED, we're done. And it is true that the data suggests that the large number of guns that we have in the US does play a role. That if you had a button to push, set aside your personal politics, just as a matter of data, the data show that if you had a button to push that would get rid of all the guns in the United States, our homicide rate would indeed be lower, perhaps substantially lower. Right? That's not a political statement, that's an empirical statement from the data. But it's also true that there's a lot more going on than just the number of guns. And so let me try and convince you of that by taking you on a little walk on the south side of Chicago. My office is at 1307 East 60th Street, the Harris School Public Policy Building. If you make a right on the 60th Street and you make a right on Dorchester and then you walk about a mile south of there, you will get to this spot. This is Dorchester and 71st. And I'm sure you all know exactly what this is. It's Easy Tree Recycling. There's wonderful slogan is a tree is a terrible thing to waste. The interesting thing about Easy Tree is that it sits right at the boundary between two Chicago neighborhoods of Greater Grand Crossing to the west and the South Shore neighborhood to the east. And the interesting thing about that is that the shooting rate per capita is consistently twice as high in Greater Grand Crossing as it is right across the street, right across Dorchester Avenue and South Shore, right? So why is that interesting? Well, if we step back and we ask ourselves what causes gun violence, I think most people would say this is obviously just as simple as gun laws. And yes, that does matter, but notice what is the same west of Dorchester Avenue and east of Dorchester Avenue is the gun laws. They have exactly the same city level gun laws, exactly the same county level gun laws, the same state level gun laws, the same federal level gun laws. And yet we have twice as many shootings east of Dorchester Avenue as west. Okay. And so, I think to me what that implies is the following, right? If gun control and gun availability is exactly the same in Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore, and yet the amount of gun violence is dramatically different east of Dorchester Avenue and west, what that tells you is that the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another has to play a really important role in its own respect as well. That is to say, gun violence is not just a mechanical function of guns, it's also a function of what's going on with violence as well. So gun violence equals guns plus violence. And in many ways, I think if you are a pragmatist and you look at what's going on in the United States, you would say these 400 million guns are not going anywhere, for better or for worse. Again, setting aside your personal politics, the 400 million guns are not going anywhere anytime soon. And we're all looking at the political environment in Washington, D.C., and we can see that the prospects for dramatic changes in gun laws in the United States are not great for the foreseeable future. So those two facts together would make you super depressed about our ability to do anything about the problem if you thought this was all about gun control. But the fact that there's a second margin of potential policy change here that you could act on is optimistic. It tells you that there's something else that you can do as we have this ongoing conversation about what the country's gun laws should be. Right? So I think this is intended to be a very optimistic point. Okay. How have we been thinking then? That raises the follow-up question. How have we been thinking then about what affects people's willingness to harm one another with these widely available guns? So in working on the book, I spent a lot of time looking at surveys of representative samples of Americans. And I can tell you that most Americans, when you ask them what causes crime, what causes violence, what causes gun violence, most Americans tend to say they believe in one of two different conventional wisdoms. So here's the first conventional wisdom, which is essentially that violence is driven by morally bad people who are just not afraid of what the criminal justice system is going to do to them. And that perspective on the problem leads you to think that the only thing that you can do to address gun violence is basically to threaten people with ever bigger criminal justice sticks. More likely prison terms, longer prison terms, and that sort of thing. Right? Most Americans who don't hold that conventional wisdom tend to hold a different conventional wisdom that says, no, gun violence is actually just due to economic desperation. These are people who are desperate to feed themselves, to feed their families, and the only thing that you can do to prevent that, to prevent gun violence, is to improve the alternatives to crime. Better jobs, more lucrative jobs, more generous social programs to help lift people's incomes. And I suspect these will not be unfamiliar ideas to you. Most of you probably, statistically speaking, most of you probably believe in one of these two conventional wisdoms yourselves. So here's what's interesting then if we return to Easy Tree at 71st and Dorchester on the south side. Guess what is exactly the same east of Dorchester Avenue and west? This is the criminal justice system. They're served by exactly the same Chicago Police Department, the same Cook County courts, the same prosecutor, the same Illinois Department of Corrections, the same US Department of Justice. It turns out, interestingly, that the poverty rate is exactly the same in South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing as well. So if you are of the view that gun violence is just mechanical function of poverty, we hear the Chicago mayor saying all the time, we are never going to solve the problem of gun violence in Chicago until we solve the problem of poverty. Think about how depressing that would be if that were true, given how hard it has been for us to solve the poverty problem. And yet, interestingly, here we have two neighborhoods with exactly the same poverty rate. And it's not that their gun violence rates are a little bit different, right? I've showed you the rate of shootings per capita is fully twice as high in Greater Grand Crossing than across the street in Dorchester. And it turns out that the racial composition, the level of racial segregation, is also exactly the same in Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. So everything that we have been talking about in terms of what drives gun violence fails to explain why you can have such radically different rates of gun violence across these neighborhoods. I would say, no wonder we've not made more progress on this problem, right? I'm not saying that these conventional wisdoms are totally wrong, but you can see how little explanatory power they have in understanding what's going on. There is a lot more to the gun violence story than conventional wisdom. And that's the argument that I want to make. There's just been a lot of unexplained aspects to this. Here's the other interesting thing about this conventional wisdom. These two quotes that I showed you, turn out to be the Republican and the Democratic presidential platforms from the 1930s. This is to say, this is not just the conventional wisdom, but this is the conventional wisdom that we have had for basically 100 years. We have been having exactly the same political fights for 100 years. We toggle back and forth between the conventional wisdom of the left and of the right. And we've been basically making no progress doing that, right? And so what I want to argue is that we need some new thinking if we're going to make progress on this. Okay, so what is that new thinking? I think the key launching point for some new thinking is to notice, I don't need to tell you how hyperpolarized American politics are in America in 2025. The left and the right agree on almost nothing. And yet, here's an interesting kind of observation, which is, if you are on the right and you think the solution to gun violence is threatening people with bigger sticks, if you are on the left and you think that the solution to gun violence is dangling more enticing carrots to people to lure them away from crime, both sides here implicitly believe that before anyone pulls a trigger, they are engaging in a kind of rational comparison of benefits and costs. That is, both sides think of gun violence as being intentional and deliberate, right? And premeditated and thought through, right? That, I think, is where we've gone sideways in our thinking. I think that is sort of the key assumption that doesn't fit with what I've come to see from the data and from the frontline practitioners about the gun violence problem. So I think we need a change in our thinking about this. We need a different view about why people are doing this. And to see this, let me show you. So I think one of the reasons that our thinking about this has gone sideways is the information that we have about the gun violence problem itself is distorted by what the media covers. This is not a criticism of the media, but it's just a fact that the picture that you get about gun violence from the media is not representative of what gun violence is, right? So when we have, every few years, tragically, we have a University of Chicago student get shot and killed in a robbery. And that, every time that happens, luckily that doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, that is not a local news story, that is not a national news story, that is an international news story, right? Whenever the US Department of Justice works with the Chicago Police Department and the US Attorney to take down a drug selling gang, like the wicked town vice lords on the west side, had a RICO charge against them, a racketeering charge by the local US Attorney. That was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune for weeks, right? And all of you have seen The Wire. If you haven't seen The Wire, I'd recommend you leave right now and just binge watch The Wire for the rest of the day. That is all showing you drug war, gang wars over drug selling turf, right? Those are the sort of the two types of shootings, but that's not what most shootings in America are. So this is a more or less randomly selected example from the Chicago Tribune. June 2nd, 2012 is a Saturday, 3 p.m, 2 groups of kids are arguing in the middle of the street about whether a kid in one of the groups stole a used bike from a kid in another group. Resale value of a used bike on Facebook on the south side of Chicago, 20, 30, 40, maybe $50 if you're very lucky. Kid in one of the groups pulls a Glock out of a semi-automatic handgun out of their waistband, fires into the other group, hits a 16-year-old kid who is then raced down Lakeshore Drive to Northwestern ER again, where he's pronounced dead. That turns out to be what most shootings in the United States are. Right, so instrumental shootings here, this is a criminology jargony term, that refers to shootings where the violence is a means to some other end. I want your phone and your wallet in a robbery. I want your drug selling corner on the west side by the Eisenhower Expressway, right? As opposed to altercations where the violence is the point, right? So the overwhelming shootings that happen in America is someone is pissed off. You go back and forth in this argument, and it ends in tragedy because someone's got a gun at hand, right? That is what American gun violence is. This is data from Chicago. If you look at data from the FBI for homicides in the United States, you see almost exactly the same pattern there as well. So in order to understand what's driving this behavior and what to do about it, we need to understand what people are doing in these moments, in these altercations. Why are you not de-escalating this? Why are you taking it in the other direction instead? And I think the easiest way to see this is through a little audience participation exercise. We'll see how this works. It's early on a gray, rainy Saturday morning. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to show you an object in the slide, and I want you to call out the color of the object when you see it. Okay, so we'll do a little practice run for starters. Okay, please forgive me for being so indelicate, but that was pathetic. This is only going to work. That is only going to work if you guys are really into this. I'm going to go really fast. Okay, so here we go. Everybody ready? All right, it's really only going to work if everybody's really engaged. Okay, here we go. Black, red, green, blue. So what was that all about? Well, there's been a lot of news about declining literacy rates in the United States. There's a little bit of a data check. But there was, in addition to being a data check, there's also sort of a deeper lesson here. So if you've ever taken a psychology class, you will recognize that as something called the Stroop test. Okay, the Stroop test is one of the most widely used experiments in all of psychology. And what does the Stroop test illustrate? The Stroop test illustrates to me what is, I think, the most profound and important lesson to me from psychology in the last 50 or 100 years, psychology and behavioral science. And that lesson is that we don't know our own minds, basically. That our minds do not work the way that we think they do. So when I say thinking, what do you think of? You think of that little voice in your head, all right? You think, you know, I've got to pick up my kid from indoor soccer practice 45 minutes after this talk ends. Do I have time to stop by Whole Foods? Parking's always a hassle. The lines are always long. If I get a few things, I can go through. That's that's the deliberate part of your mind, the little voice in your head. To the extent to which you have the capacity to be rational, that is that little voice in you. It doesn't mean that it's always rational, but to the extent to which you have the capacity to be planful and weigh pros and cons and things like that. Psychologists call that slow thinking, system 2 thinking. If you've read the wonderful book by Danny Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, if you haven't read that, go binge watch The Wire and then read Thinking Fast and Slow. This is a book, I promise you, it will change the way you understand yourself. It'll change the way you understand the people around you. It'll change the way that you think about the world as a whole. I have no financial connection to Danny Kahneman and the book. It is a book that changed my own thinking about so many things. I cannot possibly recommend it highly enough. The lesson and he just wonderfully summarizes this really important lesson from psychology. This sort of deliberate kind of slow thinking is very powerful, but very mentally taxing. If you're a crossword, if you do the crossword as my wife does, she does 15 minutes of the crossword and then she gets up and she refills her coffee and she pets the dog and then she goes back to do it again. If you were to install a camera in my office at the University of Chicago, which I hope they have not done, you would see I show up every day at the office at 8:15 after dropping my daughter off. I do 15 minutes of really focused work, and then I go spend 5 minutes reading about the Philadelphia Eagles. I grew up in New Jersey right outside of Philadelphia. Then I'll do another 15 minutes of work, and then I'll read 10 minutes about the Eagles. You can see how this cycle goes over the course of the day, right? It is just really, really exhausting to think. It's so mentally taxing that all of us have developed, our minds have evolved to develop a very different type of cognition that happens below the level of consciousness. It's fast, effortless. We don't even know that it's happening. Psychologists call this fast thinking or system 1 thinking. If you've read the Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink, that's what this is about as well. And so this is a series of automatic responses that we've developed that are adaptive to situations that we see over and over again in our daily lives. And these responses are involuntary, they're almost involuntary, right? And I think the lesson that I want to make in this book, the argument that I'm making is gun violence is much more a problem of system 1 than we've thought. We've conceived of it as a system 2 problem. It's much more of a system 1 problem. You couldn't live without system 1 responses But these normally useful responses can get us into trouble when they're overgeneralized in the wrong situation. And that's what the Stroop test really illustrates. So what is a common situation that you see over and over again? See word, read word. You're driving down 94 West from downtown in Chicago, you see a billboard. The little voice in your head does not say, should I read that? You just automatically read it. You couldn't not read it if you tried, right? So see word, you automatically read the word. That's normally useful to you, but remember what System 1 fast thinking is doing is it's fast, effortless, you're outsourcing what you're doing all the time, but nothing in life is free. That fast, effortless response comes at the cost of accuracy. And so what the Stroop test is doing is it's putting you in an out-of-the-ordinary situation that looks like a situation you've seen over and over again, but now your normal automatic response gets you into trouble, right? You're not normally in a situation where you see the word and say the color instead of see the word, read the word. Okay, so what in the world does that have to do with gun violence? Well, we know, unfortunately we know, that in lots of under-resourced neighborhoods in Chicago and in cities all across America, kids learn very early on that the adults in their neighborhoods are overwhelmed. You know, I was driving around with a commander in Englewood, the commander in Englewood, several years ago, the police commander. On a Friday night, we're going down 63rd Street, one of the main commercial east-west arteries in Englewood. It's a Friday night in the summer, and it's a two-lane road in both directions, and I'm sitting in the passenger seat next to him, and there's a car in front of us that is swerving across all 4 lanes. And so the commander steps on the brakes and puts some more distance between us and the car. And I turned to him and I said, I think that guy's drunk. And the commander turned to me and he said, I do too. And I said, what, aren't you going to do anything? Like, you are not just a cop, you're the cop. You're the commander of the Englewood district. Like, aren't we going to stop him? He turned to me and he said, Jens, if I stopped every drunk driver in Englewood on a Friday night, I wouldn't have any time to worry about the real problem in Englewood on a Friday night, which is gun violence. Because you listen to the police radio in District 7 on a Friday night, and literally every 15 minutes, it's a man with a gun call or a shots fired call. Now, you're a kid growing up in Englewood, you're walking to school, and another person challenges you for your lunch money. You learn that there's not an adult who you can go to with that problem. And you also learn that if you hand over your lunch money today, you've just signaled to the whole neighborhood that you're an easy victim. Tomorrow they're coming back for your wallet. The day after that, they're coming back for your phone. The day after that, they're coming back for your winter coat, right? So in that sort of neighborhood environment, your System 1 quickly learns, when I am challenged, I have to push back hard. That's the adaptive automatic response. And notice how the severity of my pushback need not be proportional to the provocation, because it is not backward-looking retribution for what you just did. It is forward-looking deterrence to signal to everybody else in the neighborhood that I'm not an easy victim, right? So I get challenged, I push back, maybe in a way that is way harder than you would have guessed from the provocation. And that response might unfortunately be adaptive to kids day to day, growing up in Englewood and lots of other neighborhoods like that. But that can get you into trouble when that response is overgeneralized. Okay, so all I've done, I just want to point out, all I've done so far, that is basically the behavioral science theory of gun violence. And I just want to point out that all I've done so far is just tell you a story. And, you know, I'm an empirical economist, I'm a social scientist. Like, I think one of the other reasons that we've not made more progress on this problem is that there's just been too much storytelling. So we were really interested, we wanted to know if this story is true, if this theory of the case of what's driving gun violence is true. And so we partnered with a local nonprofit in Chicago called Youth Guidance. And they have been running for many years a program called Becoming a Man. And let me just describe to you the very first exercise in the Becoming a Man. So it's for middle school and high school age male students in public schools in disadvantaged South and West Side Chicago neighborhoods. So they bring the kids once a week. They get out of a class, they go, 12 kids, one BAM counselor. So Bobby and I would be like a pair. They'd give me a rubber ball. They'd say to Bobby, you've got 30 seconds to get the ball out of Jens's hands. The only rule is that there are no rules go. So Bobby would basically beat the crap out of me for 30 seconds. And then they'd call time and they'd switch, and then I'd basically beat the crap out of Bobby for 30 seconds. And then the counselor would bring the kids back together and debrief. And so the counselor would turn to Bobby and say, what strategy did you tell me, how did you try and get the ball out of Jens's hand? So Bobby would say, well, the first thing that I did is I put him in a headlock. That didn't work. And so then I punched him in the stomach a couple times. That didn't work. I tried to pry his hand open. I think I broke his pinky, but he's tougher than he looks. Maybe that would have to be tautologically true. And he still didn't give the ball up, so I started to bite his ear, and then you called time. And then the BAM counselor will turn to Bobby or the kid in Bobby's situation and say, why didn't you ask him for the ball? Now, youth guidance tells me that, in the 10 or 15 years since the program has been in existence, they say that they've served maybe something like 10,000 kids by now, and they say like literally not more than a dozen kids ever ask. And most of the kids in Bobby's situation would say, if I would have asked Jens for the ball, he would have thought I was out, and you can imagine what the kids say. Sounds very familiar. And then the kicker is the BAM counselor then turns to me and says, Jens, what would you have done if Bobby had asked for the ball? And I said, it's just a stupid rubber ball. I would have been very happy to give it to him. It's way better than having this guy break my finger, punch me in the stomach, bite my ear in a very creepy way, blah, 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 right? And so what is the fist exercise doing in becoming a man? Here's the challenge situation. My adaptive automatic response is, I get challenged, do not look weak. And I'm holding a mirror up to you, showing you, here's your normal automatic response can sometimes be wrong, right? And I'm giving the kid feedback that this situation is not what you have assumed, and importantly, that is show, not tell. Right? Another way to think about what BAM is doing is all of us learn through trial and error. Right? Here's another way to think about it. All of us learn how to navigate life through trial and error. And when most of us in this room make a mistake, the consequence is a little embarrassment. We overspend for something, whatever, right? But when you're a 16-year-old kid growing up in Englewood, the consequences of making a mistake are really, really high. That's why the book is entitled Unforgiving Places. And part of what programs like Becoming a Man are doing is it's giving kids opportunities to learn through trial and error in simulated situations where the consequences are much less severe. It's giving them lots more repetitions to learn through trial and error. Okay, so we structured this in 2009, 2010. We worked with the Chicago Public Schools and Youth Guidance to basically do like a randomized trial in medicine of BAM, where we enrolled 2,700 kids. Half of them were offered BAM, half weren't. We find that 10 to 15 hours of BAM reduces violence involvement rates by nearly 50%. We're super surprised by then Rahm Emanuel was mayor. We go to City Hall, we say, Mr. Mayor, we're seeing these astonishing results. He says, this is amazing. Normally I don't have much to say besides some get tough thing. We'll put some city money behind this. We said, we were so surprised by the first round of results. Let us do a lottery, so basically do another randomized trial to make sure this is a real thing. We see a similar reduction the second time around. This could not be true if conventional wisdom were true. Becoming a Man is not threatening people with stiffer punishments, and it is not ending poverty and segregation, whatever, in Chicago, right? So this shows you that conventional wisdom is just not right. Now we've got data, as good as data ever gets in social science, to show us that our thinking about the problem is wrong. This also gives us a way to understand the Greater Grand Crossing South Shore difference, right? So as a reminder, right? As a reminder, the reason that we rely on System 1 is because System 2 is mentally taxing. What that suggests is that in neighborhoods where people are under more stress, that is, that they've got more of a mental bandwidth tax, you would expect people to be more reliant on System 1. That should lead to more violence. And when you look at the data, you can see that there are lots more stressors in Greater Grand Crossing than in South Shore. If you look at like the 311 data for calls for graffiti, for instance, when you look at abandoned lots and indicators of trash and that sort of thing, if you look at where COVID hit hardest, it hit Greater Grand Crossing much harder than South Shore. So the number of people who are grieving the loss of a loved one or a neighbor or a friend is much higher there. All of that is going to tax people's bandwidth. And the other thing, if you know the South Side of Chicago, you will realize that one big difference, so their poverty rates are exactly the same. But South Shore has the historic advantage of lying along the best part of Chicago, which is Lake Michigan. And so historically, that's where all of the commercial developed. And so in South Shore, there are a lot more people walking around, going to the local store, going to the local restaurant, coffee shop, who are available to step in when you see groups of people arguing. There are more people around to step in and help de-escalate. What Jane Jacobs, 60 years ago in her wonderful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, called Eyes Upon the Street. Much more of that in South Shore than in Greater Grand Crossing. Okay. Here's another way. I have not just cherry-picked Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. Here's a way to see, I think, this to me, I think, was one of the most important figures that we put together in my time at the Crime Lab. It's a graph of all of Chicago's 77 community areas. There's 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. Median household income is on the x-axis, going left to right. So poorer neighborhoods to the left, richer neighborhoods to the right. Shooting victimization rates per capita is on the y-axis. More shootings to the top, fewer shootings at the bottom. And what you can see is that all rich areas are safe, okay? What you can also see is all of the high violence areas are poor. No wonder everybody thinks that this problem is driven by, people are not crazy for thinking that the problem is so strongly driven by poverty, right? Here's what is very hard to see just from the news coverage and firsthand experience is the huge number of very low income neighborhoods that are remarkably safe. Or put differently, the same level of family income in a neighborhood can give you a shooting rate of X or literally 20X, right? That shows you, like, one way to think about this is it's not just neighborhood poverty, it's neighborhood vibrancy as well. That's the eyes on the street point here. And things like mental bandwidth tax and so on. And interestingly, you see the same thing when you look across countries as well. If violence really were a mechanical artifact of poverty, India would be one of the most dangerous countries in the world. And instead, you can see the murder rate in India is even lower than it is in the United States, despite the huge difference in GDP. There's something else going on just besides poverty. Okay, so I'm nearly done, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. But I think maybe the two other things that I just want to point out is this perspective on the problem also gives us a way to understand why the different things in the research literature, like social scientists have been trying to figure out what to do since the National Academy of Sciences report, even before that. What can we do to address the gun violence problem? Over time, we've started to identify a few different things, but they seem like super disconnected and random, like what is going on here? And I think that this behavioral science perspective on the problem helps you see that they're all acting on the same thing, right? So there's a bunch of research literature that suggests that when you put more cops on the street, violence goes down and arrests for violence go down. The cops are doing something preventive. Most people normally would say, oh, I see the cops, what the cops are doing is deterrence. I think the cops are doing something beyond deterrence. I think they're also helping interrupt violence. And having spent a lot of time going around with the Chicago police, I've seen lots of interruption of violent events by Chicago police officers. Some of you have been reading about community violence intervention groups, right? You might have seen the wonderful film, The Interrupters, right? These are nonprofits. They've got people who know what's going on in the street. When they hear of conflict, they sort of step in and help negotiate the conflict would be one way to think about it. Why is that a promising strategy? Because that is, notice, that also makes no sense under conventional wisdom. It's not punishing people. It's not ending poverty. Like, what in the world is going on? Now you can see, oh, I see, if it's arguments and this is helping de-escalate that, I understand why that's so important. Sociologists have long thought one of the most important things that varies across neighborhoods that's relevant for violence is what sociologists call collective efficacy, the willingness of neighbors to step in and intervene on behalf of the community good. Why is that so important? Now we know, right? Urban design people have pointed out that when you clean up a vacant lot and turn it into a pocket park instead, shootings go down not by a little, but by a lot, up to 30% in low-income neighborhoods, 30% from turning a vacant lot into a little pocket park. What is going on? The survey data show that when you do that, more people are out of their houses, right? That is another way of seeing the importance of eyes on the street. Changing the built environment, cops on the street, violence interrupters, social capital in the neighborhood, these feel like super weird things to be related to gun violence. They don't fit on your conventional wisdom at all, but once you see the behavioral science perspective, you see, oh, they're all acting on the same thing. And I would also say that this perspective helps us understand what doesn't help, right? So for 100 years, we've been putting money into things like job training programs and higher minimum wages and more generous social programs and so on. Let me just be clear, those are super, super important for improving people's material conditions. Like, that is very, very clear. But we've hoped that those social policies would have the double dividend of also solving this other big social problem of gun violence, and it doesn't, right? We need to do something that is directly targeted on the problem of gun violence, not just hope that ending poverty would reduce gun violence, and now we understand why, because it's arguments. Okay, so, I think, as I said before, the problem is just much more of a system one problem than system two than we thought. Here's the very last thing that I want to say, which is I have come to think that gun violence is the problem that sits upstream of every other social problem. And this is also an argument if you live in Skokie or Evanston or Wilmette, or I lived in downtown Chicago, I don't know most of these suburbs up here, but any one of these other sort of affluent suburbs up here on the North Shore, why should you care about this problem? Here's why. This is a graph that shows the population for New York and Detroit as a fraction of both cities' 1950 population levels. My University of Chicago colleague Steve Levitt wrote a paper with Julie Cullen at UCSD several years ago where they showed that every murder that happens in a city reduces the city's population on net by 70 people. That's fewer people moving in, more people moving out. Okay, now obviously there are lots of reasons why city populations ebb and flow over time, but when you do the math, that turns out to be a really important reason, a really important reason. And so you can see, I grew up in New Jersey, as I mentioned. Whenever we'd have German relatives come, we'd always take them to New York City. I can tell you that New York City in the 70s and 80s was not a great place. And you can see that New York had lost about 10% of its population relative to 1950 in that period. And then New York City became safe, and from that point, their population grew by about 20%. Go to New York City today, and it is a they have problems, but that is what a thriving city looks like. Detroit, on the other hand, is consistently one of the most dangerous, violent cities in the country. They have lost 2/3 of their population since 1950. Gun violence is one important reason why. And if you've been reading about Detroit over the last however many years, it is insanely difficult for Detroit to do any sort of city service well. It is really, really hard to provide good school services to kids in a neighborhood where the footprint of the city hasn't changed and you've lost 2/3 of your population. And on and on down. Where does the tax revenue go to fund social programs for people when the 2/3 of the people who had money have left the city, right? So if you're living in Skokie, you would much, much rather be adjacent to a city that is thriving like New York than a city that is dying like Detroit. This is why everybody should care in the entire Chicagoland area, whether you live on the south and west sides. Obviously the most important reason to care, this is the Ethical Humanist Society, the most important reason is that this is a humanitarian tragedy. Unfortunately, that has not motivated enough people to care. I think there's a self-interested reason for more people to care as well. So where is Chicago here? Chicago is right on the knife's edge between New York and Detroit, right? So this is a critical window for the city of Chicago to decide which direction we want to go in. I think the lesson of the book really is, I think, hit home for me when I was on the, I was in the juvenile detention center on the west side of Chicago talking to a staff member there who said, 20% of the kids in here are psychopaths. You let them out, they're going to hurt people. But the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. I think that is really the point of the book. It's not just about bad people. It's not just about bad economic conditions. It's about normal people making bad decisions in these very difficult 10-minute windows. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Professor Ludwig, for your talk. The Q&A period will follow a musical interlude, and you in the audience should be thinking about questions you may have. During the interlude, we will be collecting contributions. Contributions can be made at our website, ethicalhumanistsociety.org/donate. A link will be posted in YouTube chat, and our in-person audience can scan the posted QR code or use the basket which will be passed around. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. The suggested donation is $10. However, any amount that one is comfortable with is greatly appreciated.
This way.
All right. I'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and we can get to more during the coffee hour after the lecture. Questions should be brief as a courtesy to others who also want to speak, and you can line up in front of the mic if you want to start ask a question.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk and your time today. So My question is, when you're showing us the data about the spread of violence amongst these communities related to their income, was there any factoring in or kind of modification based on the change of the demographic history of those neighborhoods? Like, just speaking for myself, I'm very aware of the evolution of the demographics of the South Shore of Chicago and how that neighborhood was specifically affected by redlining, but I don't have that same knowledge for the GCC that you used in comparison. I'm not sure if that has been more historically of a certain demographic than, say, South Shore was within the city's history and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I think the right image to have in mind is you can't. I'm looking at the graph here. So most of the low-income neighborhoods, especially on the south and west sides where the gun violence is most concentrated, are predominantly African American. Right. And they tipped about the same point in time.
I don't know how, I would have to, I come from a family of involved Chicagoans, including a brother who's an urban planner, so I'd have to tug more. But there are definitely neighborhoods in this spread that are more historically black than others just because of how certain things happened with redlining in the 60s.
No, so it's definitely, in the book I talk about sort of the unfolding of the racial tipping in Chicago, and right, and so as I think most people probably know, up until whenever it was in the 20th century, blacks living in Chicago were confined to a very small, tightly defined area called the Black Belt on in the middle of the South Side. And then some point over the 50s and 60s, depending on the neighborhood, there was a bunch of tipping. I don't think that, oh, sorry, again, you can't see it.
It's up there now.
Oh, it's up there now. Yeah. I don't think that explains very much of the difference. This is a huge, like, controlling for when neighborhoods changed, controlling for the amount of redlining and all of that stuff. Like, that was, here's another way to say it, that was super widespread all of that was super widespread over the south and west sides of Chicago.
Yeah.
And yet you can see, these are not small differences in shooting rates across neighborhoods, right? These are like 20-fold differences. Like, look at the murder rate for the shooting rate for Armour Square compared to West Garfield Park.
Right, I understand, yeah. But that data has not done anything to accommodate that and confirm that.
In the book, I also show what's been happening to racial segregation over time in different neighborhoods. And you can see there's been almost no changes in racial, like there was a big tipping, as we all know, and then just huge persistence in segregation still then.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Great talk. I have a question also about what you considered when comparing neighborhoods. Did you consider funding of education level, schools?
Yeah, so one of the arguments that I make in the book is that public education matters a huge amount for violence, but not for the reason that you think, right? I think most conventional wisdom would say, like if I were to give you all a pop quiz, you would say, of course education matters for violence because education reduces poverty. You know, you have a high school degree, a college degree, a master's degree, whatever, your income goes up and so then you're less whatever. We've just seen that income does not have the protective effect against violence that you would have guessed. I think one of the really underappreciated, super important reasons why education matters for violence is it makes you more skeptical of the first impression that comes in your mind, right? You're doing your math homework. I've got a 12-year-old and I spend every evening helping her with her math homework, right? You're doing your math homework in 7th grade and you jump to a conclusion about what the answer is, and then you get your homework back and it's got a big red circle and an X through it, so that's wrong. Then the next time you do it, you do it very quickly and then you're like, oh, last time I did that quickly, so then you redo it in the margin. That is your system 2 mind now becoming a little bit more skeptical of system 1.
Critical thinking skills.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to think about it as critical thinking. There's a way to think about it more generally as you understanding your own mind better and becoming more skeptical of your own mind. And so I think schools do that really well right now, inadvertently. There are a bunch of, this is something that we've been trying to work on as well. How can we get schools to be more deliberate in developing kind of critical thinking and decision-making skills? I think that would make schools even more helpful for this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a little nervous, but okay. My question to you, I will give you a question, and then I'll give you my thought, and then I'm going to ask for your thoughts. Okay, now you said, all right, the question would be to you, how do we get more eyes on the street and more vibrancy in the neighborhood? Okay. I was a teacher in the inner city. My thoughts a long time ago, just thoughts, was what was needed would be take one of those abandoned homes, and there were many in the neighborhoods that I taught in, and convert them into like little hull houses, and you would judge the population, and then in these hull houses, and on the first floor would be that. The second floor would be a police station, neighborly, friendly police, which of course would help. And I thought, like teaching, getting the preschool, and having someone taught, and getting those parents within that neighborhood to come to learn for education purposes, for social purposes, but making it very small.
Yeah.
But, like little minor.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that was
great.
my thought. What would be your thought, since you were saying more eyes?
Yeah, yeah. I would say, I think that there is very good empirical evidence to suggest that anything that generates more foot traffic helps. So if we had the money to create a bunch of hull houses, or little mini hull houses all over the city, let's do that. That would be great, right? If we don't have the money to do that, there's still lots of other things that we could do as well, right? Like Cook County has something called the Cook County Land Bank that is trying to make it easier to turn abandoned, vacant, I lived on the south side for 18 years. There are so many vacant lots where it's like tall grass, trash, auto parts, empty heroin baggies, needles, used condoms, these are not inviting places to bring people out into public. Abandoned houses themselves are not inviting places. When we moved to Hyde Park 18 years ago, there were 2 abandoned houses right across the street from ours in Hyde Park. That does not make you want to go hang out in the neighborhood. So all of that would be really making it easier to zone in commercial, right? Why is it so hard to zone in, to get more commercial on the south and west sides or anywhere in Chicago? I mean, partly corruption, it is Chicago, but also partly because it is really hard to go through all of the regulatory hoops. As many of you know, there's a big abundance debate within the United States right now. Can we make it easier? Can we make government work better for us? To reduce the number of regulatory burdens to do things that everybody agrees we should do. One way, another way to think about how to get more eyes on the street is let's start the abundance agenda in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods of the south and west sides, right? Let there be more stores and stuff like that, or mini hull houses, or whatever it is. Yeah, thank you. I totally agree, and lots of other things that we could do even beyond that. Yeah, yes, sir.
Well, thank you. This was great. Definitely fascinating angle and everything. But something I'd like to come back to that you more or less started the talk with was the cross-country data, right? So this is an interesting count. I think it makes a lot of sense intuitively, but I don't know how it fits into the international data where you showed the huge disparities in violent crime between the US and the UK, for example. And I know you had the little split down by, there's more guns here, or more gun violence, and the non-gun violence is more or less consistent, but that doesn't also fully fit with countries like Switzerland, where there are lots of guns, but not a lot of gun violence.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious. I feel like you sort of led with that, but then you never kind of came back to it. How does this fit into
perfect.
the cross
Great.
country
Yeah,
data?
it's a 250-page book. I didn't want to read every page to you, so thank you for the opportunity to bring it back. Thank you. So what I would say is, here's one way to think about it, which is, I think it goes back to gun violence equals guns plus violence. So when you look at let's take the UK versus the US for starters, and then I'll come back to Switzerland in a second as well. When you look at the US versus the UK, the rates of overall violent crime are not so different across the two countries, right? The key reason why the US murder rate is so much higher than the UK's is because we have so many guns here, right? And so that's partly why I started off to say, if you could wave a wand and make all the guns go away in the United States, that would bring us much closer to the UK, right? But we can't do that. Or if someone has an idea for how to do, I have not come across anybody who knows how to do that. So assuming for the moment that we can't do that, this perspective makes you think, oh, there's a different way that we could get to the UK outcome, which is to reduce our violent crime rate relative. If we have more guns than the UK and we want a similar murder rate, then we've got to push further on the violence dimension. Does that make sense? So another way to see it is like Switzerland and Canada have very similar levels of gun ownership, but the murder rate in Canada is much, much higher than it is in Switzerland. And that's because there's a lot more violence, a lot more violent crime in Canada than there is in Switzerland. So that shows you the independent role of violence in driving these cross-country differences. So because we have so many guns, it is incumbent upon us to do an extra good job in figuring out how to reduce violent crime. Does that make sense?
Yes, you were sort of approaching this with one of your last slides that brought in New York and Detroit. Correct me if I'm wrong in my statistics here, but my understanding is that as of recent years, the crime rate and murder rate, et cetera, in New York City and Los Angeles, for example, are much lower than here in the United States. What are they doing that we haven't done yet?
Yeah, I think, when I look at the criminology literature and I talk to people who've worked in the criminal justice systems in both LA and New York, I think the thing that comes up consistently in understanding that, so it's wild to think out from the 2025 perspective. In 1991, the murder rates in LA, New York, and Chicago were almost identical. Almost impossible to believe now, given how much safer LA and New York are, to your question. I think the most plausible explanations to me were they were early and rapid adopters of data-driven policing. They basically they took their police departments from like 18th century organizations into 21st century organizations. Most police departments around the country are still much more like 18th century organizations and 21st century organizations. That's important because there's a lot of predictability for when these 10-minute windows happen by time and place. So using data to put your cops in the right place turns out to be remarkably important. And I think the second thing that New York and LA did is they were early and rapid adopters of community violence intervention. Both cities were among the first to really systematically put city dollars into nonprofits to do a bunch of the things that I talked about in the talk. So I would say that's my hypothesis for what's going on. And the good news is that every city in principle could do both of those things, right? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Ali Abid. I work for the Cook County Justice Advisory Council. We're one of the grant makers for community violence intervention with county dollars. And a question I had for you was sort of one of prioritization. One of the things we're seeing is all our federal dollars are drying up. So now our big, $85, $100 million that we've been able to put into community violence intervention groups are going to be shrinking down to tens of millions of dollars across the various government agencies. So I wanted to tease apart a little bit of the sort of interventions that might work, and I'm hearing stuff about the eyes on the street. If we could do all these things to get people out into their communities, engaging hopefully in pro-social ways, but just walking across the street, that would be great. The youth guidance, the BAM model is very interesting because it's and I would love to hear you talk about this. Like that seems to be working on a different aspect of this, which is it's talking to kids not out. It's not necessarily pushing kids out in the street and be like, play. You know, it's talking to them, and yet it's also having a similar sort of system 2 maximizing or system 1 sort of moderating approach. And I'm wondering, like, as it's not directly working on the eyes on the street sort of like type of intervention, how do you envision that working, or like ways to scale that type of thing?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Here's I think when you take an economics class, the very first class, the very first 5 minutes, the economics professor says, there are not $100 bills on the sidewalk, because if they were there, somebody would have picked them up. I think for public safety in Chicago, there is a $100 bill on the sidewalk in the following sense, which is like, when you look at the data on shootings in Chicago, 90% of the offenders and 80% of the victims have a prior arrest record. So what that tells you is that almost everybody involved in this problem, on either side of this problem, has been in the care of the criminal justice system at some point. We had a chance to do something to put their lives onto a different trajectory, and we blew it. We missed that chance. So what would that thing look like? Well, the reason that I was in the juvenile detention center, like going back to the quote, the reason that I was there is we were in there right after a federal judge had ordered it to be taken over by an administrator named Earl Dunlap, who came in. He was like, we got to make this place better. This is where the highest risk kids are held awaiting, highest risk in the opinion of the juvenile justice system are held awaiting adjudication of their case. And he was like, we got to make it better. I don't have any money. He's looking around in the afternoon. The kids go to this public school in the morning. In the afternoon, they sit around watching TV, while a guard stands along the wall watching the kids watch TV. And Earl basically trained the guards to deliver a BAM-like program in the afternoon. Almost zero marginal cost to do that. You've got the guard, you've got the kids, you've got the building. The marginal cost is just a week of training and the cost of mimeographing some program booklets. Like, basically free. We structured that like a randomized controlled trial, reduced recidivism for these kids at really high risk of violence by 20%. You might be like, 20%, I'm not sure I should be impressed. Give me 5 things that reduce violence by 20% and they're all free, I think we're really talking. And the JCDC, they were doing that for many years and then just stopped. Why, right? Why are we not doing that in the juvenile detention center when we know that those kids are at super high risk for violence involvement? Why are we not doing that in the Cook County Jail when we know that the guys coming out of there are at super high risk for violence involvement? Why are we not doing that in every Illinois Department of Corrections when people come in, so we've got less violence in the facility, and right before people come out, so we have less recidivism and violence when they come out? If you can train guards to do this, this is basically a free intervention, and we have found that you can train the guards to do this. That to me is like the unreal, and anybody that has any sort of involvement in local government, please, please, please try and get us to do that, because it is like dirt. I understand the shrinking of the dollars, but you could do that at really low cost.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
So in your talk, at one point you mentioned social capital. And I was looking at those neighborhoods, the 20 plus different, or the 20 time difference. Is there anything in the book that talks about the social capital infrastructure of those communities? Some of them have very rich social capital institutions or organizations that are very active in the community. Some of them may be less transient than other communities, so they have deeper family ties. Is there any kind of indication of that being a factor? And also, if so, what can be done to cultivate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, one of the things that made me saddest in writing the book is that we could not measure social capital for neighborhoods, right? And the problem there is like the government collects administrative data on shootings per capita and median household income, but there's no government agency that is, through the course of its operations, is collecting measures of social capital in these neighborhoods. And so To the extent to which we know anything about social capital, it is social scientists desperately trying to raise money to go out and measure it. Everybody thinks that feels like a nice to have, not a need to have. So we have little snippets for a few neighborhoods here and there, but no like really reliable measures. I think that would be super, super useful to understand, because the measurement challenge is so hard. It also means that nobody really knows how to stimulate more of it. And so if I'm like looking ahead to like, what would be one of the most important things that social science could do? I think it would be exactly what you described. Like, are there low-cost ways of feasibly measuring and reliably measuring social capital? And then can we try a bunch of interventions now that we can measure when we're getting more or less of it? Can we try different things to stimulate more of it? I totally agree. It's a super important thing, and I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer right now. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in knowing what the future questions are that you're considering for your research, and also if there's consideration of doing some of the interventions with family units.
Yeah, I think, so lots of people have the very understandable idea that, families are so important, we should be intervening at the level of the family. And I think there is good evidence to suggest that many of you here are probably, or maybe familiar with something called the Nurse-Family Partnership that works with first-time low-income moms even before birth, like during second trimester or third trimester, and then having nurses come talk to them about different parenting strategies before the baby's born, after the baby is born. There's really good evidence that that generates long-term lasting benefits to kids. I think for the sort of BAM-like programs that I'm describing, what we have found ourselves is that it is really, really hard to get people to consistently participate out in community settings. Unfortunately so. Unfortunately so. So I think one of the big things that I've been trying to think about in terms of research in the future is, I just mentioned, BAM-like programs in detention facilities. I think the other thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how can we, and it's in some sense sort of implicit in your question is like, how do we intervene even earlier before the detention facility? And one of the things that I've been trying to think really hard about is, what could we do in the school setting? I went to Lenape High School in Medford, New Jersey, and the New Jersey Department of Education in their wisdom made me take 4 years of health education, if I remember correctly, where I learned that I should be eating more broccoli, I should be getting more sleep, I should not be drinking alcohol, and here's where babies come from. Not super helpful, right? If you look at the data, what are the leading causes of death to American adolescents? It's homicide, especially in low-income minority communities. It's suicide, it's car crashes, and it's drug overdoses. I would call those deaths of decision-making. And this goes back to a previous question. What are the schools right now doing to deliberately teach decision-making? Basically nothing. We just hope that kids inadvertently learn it as a byproduct of learning the periodic table of elements or whatever, right? And I've been trying to think of ways, how do we be much more deliberate to inject that in the public schools? The detention facilities are great because they reach the population at outsized risk of gun violence involvement, but clearly better still would be to do what the public health people call primary prevention and reach everybody even before they get to that stage. Schools turn out to be really, really resistant to change. And I also think that we don't quite know how to do that in the school setting yet. And so that's what we're working hard to figure out right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of information. So I'm thinking of a couple slides that I'm going to tell you about so you can think of what I'm thinking. So I was thinking about the countries compared near the very beginning, right? Where, we have tons and tons of guns, but even still, we had a high violence rate. It was high. But I would like to see that again. But so then we're talking about Switzerland having the same number of guns. Were they on that chart? Thank you. Sorry.
No problem at all. Okay.
Are they on there?
No. Whenever there's a slide that's badly done, I made it. So this does not have Switzerland. This does not
Okay.
have Switzerland on
Like,
it. Sorry
are there
about that.
countries on there that have like a similar number of guns?
There is no rich country in the world that has a level of gun ownership per capita anything
we
like
do.
ours. In the
Okay.
book, I've got a graph that shows it plots gun ownership rates against homicide rates,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see the Switzerland-Canada comparison. You can also see that we are just like off the charts. in
So
terms of gun
Switzerland and Canada are more similar?
Switzerland and Canada are the two that I think you could sort
Okay.
of compare to one another. And if you look at the book, you can see the graph there.
Right, okay, thank you. So I'm just kind of thinking too, so it's like we know guns are not just the problem, it's violence that's the problem. So you had the conversation about the different kinds of thinking, right? And it's like, and then also the slide that was, sorry, also the slide that had like so much of this violence is the altercations, right? And the
Yep.
snap decisions. So it's like countries that have less violence, but like how are they having less violence if they're still humans and they still have like the same thinking? Like, does that make sense? Like,
Yep.
how are they doing it different? Like, why are we more violent here? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No,
Sorry,
it
I'm
does-
like,
it
there's
does-
so much in my brain.
Yeah. So, I think what is clear is that Switzerland has, or it seems clear that Switzerland has less violence than Canada. And, I don't, like, it seems to me, like, we don't completely understand why different countries have different violence rates.
Okay.
Right, so that's there seems to be something about the Commonwealth countries,
Okay.
Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, where they tend to have more violence than other countries, right? Other rich countries, sorry. So I'm not talking about like South America, Central America kind of thing, right? We don't sort of fully understand that. We do know that when you do these BAM-like programs, violence rates go down a lot. So we don't, at this point, this also goes back a little bit to the previous question, like what more do we need to understand? I think understanding better why violence rates vary so much across countries, I think would be a really important thing to understand.
So yeah, the education. I'm actually a teacher, and so I was thinking about like your BAM stuff that you were talking about, and I was like, I teach kindergarten, so we're at the very foundation, right? Where it's like we're trying to teach problem-solving skills and that kind of thing. So do you think that education might be like a really big part of the violence? Like, is Switzerland like just doing more for their younger kids as they grow? Like, I guess we don't know, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Sadly, what I don't know about Switzerland could fill books.
Yeah, or not just, that's just the one I keep talking about.
No. But I mean, like, here's what I think the data are very, very clear that if you improve education, violence goes down a lot.
Okay.
What I don't know is whether differences across countries in their educational systems, including early childhood all the way up to whatever, I don't know if that can explain differences across the countries.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Something to look into.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So I believe Chicago has reported the lowest number of murders since 1965. What programs do you think might be accounting for that and for the change in level of crime in Chicago? And as a follow-up to the BAM exercise, after the kids have been done beating each other up, what's done to calm them down and get them to like each other again?
Yeah. I think, on that point, I think that the key lesson there was, the BAM holding up a mirror to your own thinking, I think was the key lesson there. They're like, oh my God, I tried to use force. I didn't even think to ask. And, getting kids to be more skeptical of their initial their perceptions. I think the one way that I think about the decline in violence that we're seeing right now in Chicago, maybe there are two key things that I would say, is we are seeing similarly large declines in violence in most US cities. I was just giving a talk at the Free Library in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago, and they're also looking at similarly remarkable declines in gun violence there. And Philadelphia, like so many cities around the country. And I think one sort of lesson that you might take from that is that makes it seem unlikely that there is a Chicago-specific explanation for what's going on if you're seeing this in every city. And so how much of that is just, the murder rate surged during the pandemic and stayed high for a few years and starting to decline. How much of what we're seeing is mean reversion from the pandemic versus us proactively doing something helpful? I don't think anybody knows that decomposition, but part of it for sure is mean reversion from the pandemic. How much, I don't exactly know. I think the second thing that I would say about the decline in violence in Chicago is, to the extent to which we've been doing helpful things, that has really been made possible in large part by this big infusion of federal pandemic relief dollars that only now are starting to go away. And so, I think a lot of people are looking at this big decline thinking, this is great. This is going to be a new age for Chicago. Everything's going in the right direction. This is the start of a trend. And I hope it's the start of a trend. I mean, obviously, I hope it's the start of a trend. The thing that makes me nervous is, with this federal money going away and every city's downtown still economically struggling since the pandemic, all of these cities are going to be facing increasingly severe budget problems. We can see that in Chicago. We're working on fixing a 1.2 billion with a B budget deficit. What happens to the violence problem if you cut $1.2 billion out of the city of Chicago budget? I don't know. So I'm waiting on the edge of my seat with bated breath and fingers crossed. Thank you. Is this, I guess, maybe a last question? Is that okay, perfect.
I might know less about Switzerland than you do, but a thing I think
I don't
I
think
know-
it's possible for you to know less about Switzerland.
Well, I was there, it was lovely, but, I didn't gather a lot of data. A thing I think I know is that the high gun thing is related to compulsory military service. And I'm wondering if that gives us a chance to think about the two different kinds of things. If I need a gun as an adult in a very controlled, disciplined environment with lots of information and worry about the lethality of this gun, it may live in my part two thinking in a different way. It may not ever creep into my 95%. It's not part of my 95%. It's a special only thing.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that kind of relates to the idea that some people have, possibly very naively, that even more education about guns and gun safety, theoretically, I think, would do that same thing. So the idea, even if we have a ton of guns, if people were taught more about them and understood them better, can we move things into the other part of your brain? It belongs in your other part of your brain. It doesn't belong in the front part of your brain.
It's a great question. So let me, the honest answer, I don't know, but let me offer a speculative hypothesis building on your observation. So my dad was in the Army. I grew up with 3 guns in the home, and if you've watched Full Metal Jacket, you have this image of Marines sleeping in boot camp with a loaded rifle next to them in their cot or something. But from hearing my dad's stories about this, it's you are not sleeping with your loaded rifle. It's they've got everything loaded up, they've got the ammunition separately, and everything is very safety oriented and so on. I'm just echoing your point and drawing out a little bit more, right? And so, I would tell you from firsthand experience, safe gun storage was very top of mind for my dad, maybe partly coming out of that Army experience. In the US context, when you talk to civilian gun owners, gun safe storage is not as top of mind as I need the gun in case, I might need the gun quickly for self-defense. And that's why you find things like loaded gun in the nightstand dresser kind of thing. And so when you hear that, you might be thinking, boy, I don't want a depressed 15-year-old to find it. But there's another, let me connect it to gun homicide. So that is for sure true, right? But on top of that, I did a study 20 years ago now that found that, the number of guns stolen out of homes in the US every year is something like 500,000. 500,000 guns are stolen out of American homes and cars every year. Those guns, by definition, go right into the hands of criminals, right? So that is a big source of supply of guns in the underground gun market. If you could get everybody to store their gun safely, that would help that problem a lot, right? And so I am a big believer in, like, could we try? I don't know what the answer is. It could be training. It could be giving, there's an organization in Connecticut that gives away free gun safes to anybody that's got a legal gun owning permit. Maybe that's it. Maybe the answer is personalized gun technology, right? Where we can build a gun now that recognizes your fingerprint or some other biometric identifier where only you can use it. That prevents the 15-year-old depressed teenager from getting it. And if it's stolen, it's useless to whoever takes it, right? So I don't know what the exact answer is, but I think your concern about about this other part of the problem is for sure on track. Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks so much again for having me.
Thanks, Professor Ludwig, for answering our questions. I'll end today's program with a closing quote. Don't let anyone tell you that these bad things happen and then everyone goes back to normal. You don't have to be everyone. Stay with the grief, stay with the anger, stay troubled by it all, stay open-hearted to those who grieve, stay tuned to those working for change. And that is from the artist Morgan Harper Nichols. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks again, Professor Ludwig, for your talk.